I would begin by saying also that we've had people mention the effect of being isolated at home because of the coronavirus. It's also worth bearing in mind that drinking alcohol lowers the body's immunity. So that's something to bear in mind as we go through this crisis. We've heard a lot today about the damage of overconsumption of alcohol, and the cost is almost incalculable when you count the cost in our families, our communities and ourselves. And the cost cannot be counted in pounds and pence, although very often we are forced to do that for practical reasons. Alcohol abuse leads people to lose their homes, their families, their jobs. There's a cost in hospital admissions on numerous occasions perhaps, and perhaps even encountering the criminal justice system. Those who are victims of alcohol abuse become economically inactive, they often become absent parents, and the damage to mental health and physical and emotional well-being is profound. And I remember standing in this chamber a couple of years ago speaking on alcohol abuse in previous years, and a number of us involved in that debate at that time were willing to admit that we came from homes with an alcoholic parent. My father was, by all accounts, an alcoholic, although I never knew him, since he died when I was 15 months old, very much helped on his way by alcohol. But the damage to my family was not insignificant. My husband's father was an alcoholic too, and he died as well from the demon drink. But these stories are not unusual. In fact, they're far too common. Almost every person you meet has a family member or who knows someone who is an alcoholic. And it's very sad, but it's a fact of life. But that doesn't mean we cannot turn things around. It doesn't mean there are not measures we can take, and as in Scotland's case, have already taken to combat this problem. But there is no silver bullet to this problem, and there is much that can be done to mitigate the harmful grip that alcohol has on our communities in the round. There's a number of measures that can be taken. In Scotland, we have around 686 alcohol admissions and 22 deaths every week due to alcohol. And in 2018, the figure for alcohol-specific deaths was 1,136. For 2018-19, there were 35,685 alcohol-related hospital admissions in general acute hospitals. And worryingly, hospital admissions are still more than 4 times higher than the levels seen in the 1980s. So clearly in Scotland, we couldn't simply shrug our shoulders and tolerate this. We tried to turn the situation around. And I am pleased that the SNP government chose to use the powers it has at its disposal to tackle this level of alcohol harm suffered by our communities at great cost to those communities on every single measure. And the Honourable Lady pointed out the need for England to have a revised or an updated alcohol strategy, and I think she's correct to say so, since the current one is out of date. Indeed, the Scottish Government developed its own alcohol strategy in 2018. Now, I could stand here today and I could talk about the fact that the Scottish Government has invested almost £800 million to tackle alcohol harm and drug use since 2008 and will allocate a further £95 million next year to reduce the harms caused by alcohol and drugs. I could mention, as I've already alluded to, the Scottish Government's alcohol framework, which sets out 20 actions which build on existing measures to change Scotland's relationship with alcohol. I could even mention the legislation introduced by the Scottish Government to ban irresponsible alcohol promotions, such as the multi-buy discounts that you see in supermarkets, which is, I'm actually worried about time, so I'll just press on if that's okay. Which is associated with a 2.6% reduction in consumption in the 12-month period following its introduction from October 2011. And the Honourable Member for Henley might be interested to know that in 2014, Scotland reduced the legal alcohol limit for drivers from 80 milligrams to 50 milligrams in every 100 millilitres of blood. And the rest of the UK, this reduction has not been made, and the UK, apart from Scotland, is currently the joint highest in Europe for the levels permitted for driving. But there's a whole range of measures that have been taken, but all of these measures on their own merits and collectively represent real action and real commitment to deal with the scourge of alcohol on our communities. And many of them were already set out by my honourable friend from East Lothian, who has significant insight into this issue from his role as the Cabinet Secretary for Justice in the Scottish Government. And there's been broad agreement today that minimum unit pricing of alcohol is the single most significant action that can be taken and has been taken to tackle alcohol harm, as we've seen in Scotland. But it's not a silver bullet. Nothing is, and nothing ever will be. As the member for East Lothian reminded us, it's part of a package of measures and must be seen in that context. And I urge the Minister to emulate this measure for England in order to benefit the communities which many members in this chamber represent. Because we have to remember that the strongest drinks on the market, we can buy England. You can buy cider for 18 pence. You can buy lager for 23 pence, vodka 36 pence, and wine for 38. I'm talking about units, not actual bottles. So minimum unit pricing was introduced in 2018 in Scotland, and this policy was delayed for several years, shamefully, as the alcohol industry dragged it through every court it could find to stop it or delay its implementation for as long as possible. But studies indicated that there would be around 121 fewer deaths per year as a result, and there would be a fall in hospital admissions of just over 2,000 per year by the end of year 20 of the policy. But sadly, Mr Chair, and this gives me no pleasure, sadly this initiative also met roadblocks on its passage through the Scottish Parliament, as opposition parties sadly opposed it, purely on the basis that nothing the SNP government brought forward could ever be supported. And whilst this is usually the response that any SNP policy meets in the Scottish Parliament, eventually the Tories abandoned this absurd opposition, but Labour could not bring itself to do so, because it was an SNP initiative, and argued against it, growing more ridiculous with every word. In the end, still not able to support it in the face of quite overwhelming evidence that it would be a key weapon in the battle against alcohol harm, they sadly contented themselves with abstaining on the issue. Now, I know that many Labour MPs from other parts of the UK looked on at their Labour colleagues with bewilderment at what was going on, not for the first time and probably not for the last time. But to put narrow party politics before public health is one of several reasons why the Labour Party in Scotland is completely adrift. Because some issues, Mr Chair, are far beyond party political lines. The evaluation of the first year of alcohol minimum pricing has been very promising. As the first country in the world to introduce this measure, we saw off-trade sales per adult in Scotland fall by 3.6% in the first year after implementation, whilst in the same period in England there was a rise of 3.2%. Scotland saw an 18.6% fall in off-trade cider sales per adult in Scotland in the year following minimum pricing, while England and Wales saw an 8.2% rise in sales. But there's still more to do, and there can be absolutely no complacency. Clearly, a 50 pence per unit price provided at the time a proportionate response to tackle higher risk alcohol use. We know there's a proven link between consumption and harm, and we know that minimum unit pricing is the most effective and efficient way to tackle the cheap, high-strength alcohol that causes so much harm. And going back to the comments made by my honourable friend from East Lothian, the World Health Organisation said with regards to tobacco education, they said that education was not and could not be as effective as regulation and government action. We need to remember this when we're seeking to tackle alcohol harm. Scotland still buys 9% more alcohol per head than people in England and Wales, but this gap is closing because of growing sales of alcohol in England and Wales last year. And I should point out that a 50 pence minimum unit price is no longer sufficient, because when it was brought in 2012, it was delayed for years after the 50 pence level was set because of the court action. So it's time to explore, I would suggest, raising that unit price to 60 pence, because the point is it has to be set at a level where it is effective, not when it's just there for some kind of virtue signalling. So 60 pence would seem reasonable to me. However, I urge the Minister to look carefully at the action taken in Scotland to tackle alcohol harm. And the Minister will know it's a basic economic fact. If the price goes up, consumption goes down. If the price goes down, consumption goes up. It's not rocket science. There are no silver bullets in tackling this issue, but there is some good practice in Scotland, and Scotland, as well as England, has to build on what we already know and what we're already doing. And I urge the Minister to emulate this practice for the good of the families and the communities who live with this scourge every day and need action.